Good evening, everyone. I want to thank all our friends and our colleagues for coming to this lecture today. I am Dr. Paulette Hazier. I'm the Chief of the Geography and Map Division at the Library of Congress, and I'd like to welcome you to Mapping Our World and our keynote address by Dr. Vicki Farini. This event is made possible by the generous contributions of donors to the Geography and Map Division in the Library of Congress. And if you'd like to learn more how you can support our division and contribute to these types of events, please scan the QR code that will be in the tonight's program. Mapping Our World is the library's celebration of this year's Geography Awareness Week, as well as our 25th annual GIS Day event. Institutions around the world celebrate GIS Day events and promote geographic information systems. The library is proud to be a founding sponsor of GIS Day all the way back in 1999. So if you know how to do math, 25 years, right? Today we continue this long tradition of supporting the awareness and the advancement of geospatial technologies. For this year's event, we are excited to be part of Live at the Library, so I hope you're all enjoying yourself today. And we have a lot of activities and a curated exhibit that'll be open after the speech, and I hope you just enjoyed being in the library. Much of the world's seafloor does remain unmapped in great detail, but modern efforts to fully map our oceans could change soon in coming years. To explore the history of ocean mapping that has brought us to this present day, we are grateful to be hosting Dr. Vicki Farini as tonight's speaker. Dr. Farini is a senior research scientist at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University, say that 3 times. For nearly two decades, she has worked at the intersection of global seabed mapping and geoinformatics, with a focus on making marine geoscience data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And if you can't remember that, it's called FAIR. Dr. Farini leads the project on the curation of the seafloor and sub-seafloor data from ships and submersibles for the U.S. academic research community. She also heads the Regional Center for Atlantic and Indian Ocean as part of the Nippon Foundation JEBCO Seabed 2030 project. Recognized as one of the inaugural Explorer Club 50 people changing the world. Dr. Farini is passionate about connecting people to the ocean through maps and data. So I really would like you to give a real warm welcome to Dr. Farini.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here today. I'm going to give you a bit of a history of ocean mapping and tell you about some of the work that my colleagues and I are doing at Lamont and elsewhere around the world. To start out, I just wanted to orient ourselves and remind us how dependent we are on maps. So this is a map that I use to find my way here today. We're accustomed to seeing lots of detail, not just in terms of what we can see visually, including the buildings and the trees and the cars and the streets, but also a lot of detail and information that's overlain on top of that, like the names of buildings, where we can find food, where we can find coffee, whatnot. And we've really come to expect to have this information in the palms of our hands, literally. But when we think about the planet as a whole and recognize that over 70% of the surface of the planet is covered by water, we have to recognize that the majority of our planet cannot be seen. So it's hidden from us, from view, by this water. So I wanted to define a word for you that I tend to use a lot. It's called bathymetry. I will argue that this is an essential ocean observation. It really helps us understand the planet. And its origin comes from the Greek bathys, which means depth, and measuring from metry. So it's really about measuring the depth of the water, whether it's the ocean or lakes or other water bodies. And the picture on the right is an augmented reality sandbox that we had on display at our open house at Lamont just a couple weeks ago. And the idea of this is that as the kids come through and they play with the sand and they reshape it, the color that's projected on top of it is just like how we would represent this on a map. So the warm colors are higher, the cool colors are deeper, and they can really see how the contours and the colors react to help us understand this two-dimensional representation that we put together and how it translates to the 3D world that we live in. So I grew up on Cape Cod in the 70s. This map that's shown here was a common placemat when we'd go out to restaurants. So I became very fascinated with maps from a young age, and there I am as Wonder Woman. And as I grew older, and of course more data became available, I've become accustomed to seeing that Cape Cod looks more like this. But growing up here, I was really fascinated by the ocean and by what was underneath the water. So this is a picture that I took in the neighborhood of ripples on the seafloor, and they're very clearly defined. The water is pretty shallow and it's very clear, so we can see it with our eyes. And what really motivates me is to try to reveal these kinds of features that are on the seafloor around the planet to everyone, yourselves included. Of course, we can't see that, like I said, and so here's an image that I took up at the Bay of Fundy, where there's a massive tidal range. And so at high tide, we see the boat floating on the surface of the water, and what we would like to do is what happens when the tide goes out here, is drain the water away and see the shape of the seafloor and also the texture and composition of the seafloor. But of course, we can't do that globally. So I thought I would dig a little bit into the Library of Congress archives and show some maps that really show the point of how we have started mapping, based on what we can see with our eyes. And so this map from 1752 shows the continents, the coastlines. It has some information about what features are named on top of the land, but really there's no information about the ocean. This map from 1840 is a particular projection that's called Mercator. It's when we take the image of the planet and we make it flat into a rectangle. So this is a common way of viewing this kind of data, but again, coastlines and what we can see above the water. This map is from Google Maps. I took it yesterday, this picture. This is the default base map from today. And so again, emphasizing that when we look at these maps, typically, we're focused on what's above the water. So really not thinking about what's below water, it's just a flat color. So early ocean mapping was really driven by the need for safety of navigation and also exploration. And so there are a variety of devices shown here that were used to physically measure the water depth. And this is analogous to what I would do as a kid, holding an oar over the side of the rowboat, measuring the depth. In this case, they're usually weighted objects that were lowered on some sort of a rope or a chain. The ones on the bottom there have little sampling devices. So not only were they measuring the distance, but they were collecting little scoops of what was on the seafloor. So measuring the depth and also trying to understand what it was composed of. This is the first published map, bathymetry map of the Atlantic Ocean from 1853. It was derived from data from the US Navy that was collected in the 1830s using this kind of technique. And the gentleman who put it together was handed thousands of ship logs to comb through and to start to assemble data and observations. And he learned not only about the shape of the seafloor, but about many other aspects of the ocean. What you can see is the locations of the depth measurements that were taken. There's little dots with numbers under it. And then he contoured to give a sense of the shape of the seafloor. Another really important part of his work overall was that he really recognized that international cooperation is critical to understanding the ocean, and particularly the scientific knowledge about the ocean. So if we jump ahead a few years to the HMS Challenger expedition in the 1870s, this really was considered the foundation for modern understanding of the ocean floor. Again, using physical measurements of the seafloor, you can see the track lines and where those measurements were taken. This work helped to reveal that the seafloor wasn't flat and featureless, just getting deeper and then shallower again, but there were big bumps and mountains and features on the seafloor. So this expedition helped to establish the systemic cross-disciplinary data collection that is very common in oceanography today. They didn't just measure the depth and what the seafloor was made of, but they did chemistry measurements, they looked at temperature, they looked at the currents, and they looked at the biology. So thousands of new marine species were identified during this expedition. And there was also, again, the recognition that international collaboration and inclusion of local knowledge really enriched their findings. So really emphasizing how important it is to come together. A little while later, we started to generally depend even more on the seafloor with the laying of telecommunication cables across the ocean, connecting Europe and Africa and, of course, North America. And so this map is from 1900 from Western Union, and it shows the locations roughly of where these were. Around the same time is when there was a call for international coordination from an organization that created an organization and a project that we now call JEBCO. There's some paper maps and globes that were out there that are derived from modern JEBCO data. But this was in 1899, there was the recognition that there needed to be some international agreement on the nomenclature and the terminology of undersea relief. As more people entered the space, we had to have a common way of sharing information and knowledge about the seafloor. So in 1903, JEBCO, which stands for the General Bathymetric Chart of the Ocean, much easier to say JEBCO, was established by Prince Albert Premier of Monaco. And this picture that's shown here is him with a group of other gentlemen that were explorers and came together to do this work. Within that same year was the first publication of a JEBCO chart. Over the next several decades, 5 different editions were compiled and published using data from a variety of sources. The initial map was based on British and French data, I believe, but then it was expanded to other countries. And since the 90s, this data has been presented digitally to the world. It's always been made available for free as an international resource. JEBCO just celebrated its 120th anniversary last year, and it is currently operated under the joint auspices of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO and the International Hydrographic Organization. So again, this international and intergovernmental role in helping to coordinate and assemble this very important data. So this is the Atlantic Ocean from the first series of JEBCO maps. It was published in 1903. Again, you can see the location, these little dots dispersed throughout the map of the individual soundings that were measured physically. You can see some of them are along transects where they did it as they were underway. And you can see again that there's some contouring and some interpretation and interpolation of what these soundings meant, what it meant about the shape of the seafloor. Fast forward to 1912, this is the second edition. A bit more soundings, a bit more detail. The cartography has advanced a bit. It's a little bit, well, it's certainly in better shape than the first image I showed. And if we move forward to 1958, this is the fourth series, there's even more soundings and more detail. And one of the important features that I'll talk about quite a bit today is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge that you can really start to see come to light through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So if we go back to those first 2 maps, the one from 1876 actually had evidence of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge there, while the one from 1853 didn't. And so this is partly because of the sparseness of the data, right? So depending on where you go and you measure that depth, if you happen to go across a particular feature, you're going to get a different image in your mind and in the data of what the seafloor looks like. So that first contour map is a little bit less consistent with what we know the shape of the seafloor is now, and the one from 1876 remarkably does show the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So in 1929, there was an earthquake off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, and that caused submarine cables to break. And this breaking of the cables actually started to motivate even more work in the deep sea and with the deep sea mapping. And it actually revealed these landslides underwater that caused the cable breakage. But this was a big motivator, as well as the technology that was evolving, that started to usher in a new era at that time in ocean mapping. And so this entailed mapping with sound. So when we use sound to map the seafloor, we measure the time that it takes for the sound signal to go from the ship to the seafloor and back. We know the speed of sound in water, so we can compute distance. Pretty simple. What this did, as this technology moved from the military space into the research space, is it allowed us to not just have discrete isolated measurements, but we could get profiles of depth underneath the ship as it moved around. So now we could have a more continuous picture of what the seafloor looks like. It also, because of the acoustic properties of the seafloor, helped us better understand or get some inclination of what the composition of the seafloor is. Was it soft and muddy? Was it hard and really reflective? And this started to give us a lot more information about what the seafloor is composed of and really the processes that are there. So the profile shown on the top here is what we now know is common, where there's, in the Atlantic, there's a broad continental shelf, and there's a slope and a rise, and then it moves out into the deeper water where the abyssal plains are. But by having these profiles, now it was a nice continuous picture that we could see. So when Lamont was founded 75 years ago, really the director, who's Morris Ewing, who's at the helm of this picture here, the ship, the Vima was our first research vessel. He instituted a policy, basically, to collect as much data as possible with as many instruments as possible in as many parts of the ocean as possible. And so this led to the collection of lots and lots of this sonar data. It also involved collecting a core, a sediment sample core every day, which became the foundation of the core repository, which still exists at our campus at Lamont in New York, where people come from all over the world to subsample this. It's really a library of Earth's history. You can extract subsamples and do analysis and understand the past. So this visionary, if you will, really helped to create the foundation upon which huge discoveries in geoscience were made. You can see the track lines in the bottom panel of the Vima when it was collecting these precision depth records. And you can see that since it was home ported in New York, there were a lot of transects that came in and out of New York. But there were a lot of transects that went across the Atlantic Ocean over to Europe and Africa. So again, having these depth profiles and having a series of them sort of in parallel started to give us a better understanding of the consistency and the continuity, latitudinally even, of some of these features. And the one feature that's most important here, which I mentioned before, or not, maybe not most important, but particularly important, is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And so as you get out toward the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the bathymetry gets shallower, there's a little dip in the top, and then it starts to get deeper on the other side. And this was evident in many, many profiles that crossed the Atlantic Ocean. So Marie Tharp, whose incredible map is on display in the other room, was working at Lamont in the 1950s as a cartographic assistant, basically, and she started to work with these profiles. And so here's two track lines of these profiles. The profiles themselves are shown on the top right, just simple elevation. And what she did is she started to expand on what she thought it meant. And so effectively, instead of just a 2D rendition, she started to make it 3D, and she expanded it adjacently. So she tried to interpolate, really. We would do this with a computer now, and she did it with her understanding of geology, of mapping, cartography, and this incredible eye for, what this data was showing her. And so after she had these little swaths, she then connected them, and she started to create this much more complete view of what she thought the seafloor looked like. So this was her first map that she produced with Bruce Hazen. It's recognized as the first scientific map of the Atlantic Ocean, and you'll see that it looks quite different from those earlier maps that I showed you, which were contour maps. So those contour maps, you have to really have an intuition and an understanding of how to interpret that and translate it in your mind to see what it means in 3 dimensions. But in this map, you start to see, with vertical exaggeration and shading, what the 3-dimensionality of the Atlantic Ocean is. And so as a comparison, within a year of the publication of that map, here's the JEBCO map that, again, just doesn't bring it to life in the same way, even though it's using a lot of the same data. So her work continued. She worked at Lamont for at least 25 years, probably a bit more, and she kind of stepped through the different ocean basins. This is a map of the Atlantic Ocean. I actually just got a physical copy of this the other day and was really excited to see that on one side of the paper is one of these images, and you flip it over on the other side is the other one. So you can actually see side by side the difference between this contour map and this three-dimensional physiographic diagram. Marie's work was disruptive. It challenged the scientific establishment, in part because she also recognized that by plotting the locations of earthquakes in the Atlantic Ocean, they also lined up with this mid-Atlantic ridge, this feature that she had discovered quite consistently in these profiles. And at the time, plate tectonics was not considered a valid theory. It was considered heresy. It really challenged the scientific establishment. And her work was at one point dismissed as girl talk. So later, her work was recognized by many as the spark that ignited the plate tectonics revolution, because it was so revealing of the seafloor and the relationships between different observations of the seafloor. So the World Ocean Floor was published in 1977. It's on display in the other room, and it is an incredible cartographic masterpiece. This was the culmination of 25 years of Marie's work with Bruce. He had passed away before this was published. A colleague of mine and a few of us in the room who still works at Lamont had been a graduate student down the hall from Bruce and Marie, and he took on the project and helped Marie get it to completion. This was painted by an artist who is Austrian, and Marie and Bruce sought him out because his landscapes were of the Austrian Alps, and they really liked the way that his artistry brought the landscapes to life. So they really wanted to work with him to do these maps. And he did the one of the Atlantic Ocean that I showed a few slides ago as well. So this partnership between artistry, cartography, and geoscience really helps to reveal the seafloor in a way that not just scientists could understand and make new discoveries about processes, but also in a way that the public could see these big seams running down the ocean, the middle of the ocean floor, that are where the plates are pulling apart, and they really rise up bathymetrically because of the heat of the magma underneath. There's all these amazing processes, and now you can just see it directly. So there's a photograph. I think this photograph's in the other room too. But what Marie did and was really spectacular, and one of the things that I really like about the story is similar to the work that she did, where she recognized that this is really like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. That's the work that we do in our group and in our broader collaborative team, as we try to splice together data that was collected for different purposes to help fill in a map and create something that's larger than the sum of the parts. So much like the work that Tharp and Hazen did, the modern ocean maps are a combination of measured and predicted bathymetry. So maybe you didn't know that the world's ocean is not yet mapped, because maps like this make you think that it is. You can see the shape of the seafloor, it's digital, it's all over the place, we see it, we know. If we take away the data that's not actually measured and make that look black, you can actually see the sparseness of data globally. So the parts of this map that are now blue are where we actually have measurements of seafloor depth, and the black are these huge areas where we have no data at all. And so we have to fill that in somehow. And the way that we do that is what we call predicted bathymetry. This is a technology that started back in the 80s and is still used today. And basically, we're using satellite data that measures the surface of the ocean, which actually responds very slightly to the shape of the seafloor. And we can use that data to model with some gravity information what we think the shape of the seafloor is like. So what's nice about this is it gives us a global picture. What's not so great is that the resolution is not as good as what we'd like to see. And the precision can vary depending on what the seafloor is actually composed of. There are places where this predicted bathymetry is 1.5 kilometers offset very easily. We see this all the time once we go and collect real data. So it's useful to fill in the gaps, but we want more detail than that. So to give you a sense of what these numbers that I just said mean, again from Google, here's an aerial image of New York, and the UN building is highlighted in the white box. If we coarsened it to the pixel resolution from satellite predicted bathymetry, we wouldn't be able to see any detail. So yes, you can get some sense, but all the detail that we've come to really rely on, and the scale that we can see with our eyes, in the room here, for example, is just nowhere near what we can see. So also in the 80s, there was a big technology transformation with the availability of multi-beam sonar. So this shows what single beam looks like, and that's equivalent to these precision depth records that Marie Tharp and Bruce Hazen worked with. And so with those profiles, you're just getting a little tiny measurement under the ship, and so depending on where you go, you might miss a feature like the one that's between these two survey lines in this image. With multi-beam, we have a fan of sound beams. And so now we're able to get a much broader view, and instead of a profile just under the ship, we're getting a profile perpendicular to the motion of the ship. So it's profile after profile after profile. And we sometimes call this mowing the lawn, because it's kind of like mowing the lawn when you survey, because you want to insonify the whole seafloor as much as you can to get as much data to paint this picture. So what this does is it helps us bring the seafloor into focus. Here's an example of what the predicted bathymetry looks like. It's pretty hard to figure out what we're looking at there, but when the ship comes along and maps it, all of a sudden we can see lots and lots of detail. Typically when we render these maps, we make the warm colors represent shallower and the cool colors deeper, just like in that sandbox. So my eye sees this very easily, but just to make sure that your eye knows what you're looking at. So this is a seamount here in the Pacific. Another example with satellite altimetry, really kind of featureless, and now the multi-beam comes in and suddenly there's a lot more detail that we just had no idea was there. So suddenly, the kind of things that I could see with my eye through the water as a child and as an adult on Cape Cod, we can start to see in the deep sea. So these ripples here look very much like the ripples in the shallow water that I just showed you. But the crests of these, the wave height, is 100 meters. So these are huge bed forms on the seafloor in 5,000 meters of water in the Argentine basin. Huge piles of mud that deep ocean currents have shaped into these beautiful ripples that we can now see as more and more ships come through and collect little bits and data, and we splice it together to create this map. So when we're out there collecting data, of course, we're on the surface of the ocean, and it can be pretty wild and inhospitable. It can be pretty rough. With this fan of sound beams, we really have to know how the ship is moving, and we have to monitor and measure all of that motion to back it out and put those depth measurements in the right place so that we have a coherent picture. This is just a couple of videos I shot when I was at sea a few years ago to give you the sense of what it feels like out there, which doesn't always feel good. This motion and the waves and the bubbles can also interfere with the sonar, and it can cause bad data. So this is what a modern multi-beam sonar acquisition system looks like. This is what we see topside on the computer when we're running the system. There's lots of numbers and lots of things being monitored. We look at the data in real time to make sure that we have the coverage that we're looking for. We're measuring not just the depth, but also the intensity of the sound that comes back. There's a lot that's factored in here. We're also able to measure details in the water column, so we can find bubbles, for example. So the acoustics have really come a long way and enriched the data sets that we can collect. Once we have the data, this is one of the tools that we use to process and make sure it's tidy and clean and coherent. So you can see here the density of the soundings. Didn't put a scale bar on this, but this is deep water. The swath, each track line that's coming through here is many kilometers wide, so we have a lot more measurements over these distances that previously were thousands of kilometers between each measurement. Once we have this data, we're not working with paper so much anymore, but there's a lot of work to do to transform it from soundings and numbers and all these different measurements that we record into something that's coherent that scientists, other scientists with different expertise can use, and also that the public can see and make sense of. So there's a whole suite of different levels of expertise and software tools that we use to do this. But ultimately, we want to move things toward the most accessible end of this continuum so that everyone can see. This is also an image that's in Google Earth. You can actually see the seafloor with data that many of us in the community have contributed there. So here's a map that was put together by some colleagues at the University of New Hampshire as part of the extended continental shelf work that the US has done. So we're looking at basically from the top of the continental shelf out to the abyssal plain. You can see a lot of features here. There are seamounts, there are some canyons and valleys that you can definitely make out morphologically. If we overlay on top of that the backscatter intensity, which again is telling us about the texture and the composition, suddenly you can see a lot more detail. You can see that there are these downslope slide sort of patterns from turbidity currents and things that are moving, and you can see different contrast, different colors that represent different sediments and different motion of the sediment as things have been deposited on the continental shelf and on the slope. We don't always run this data or collect this data in a completely uniform survey pattern. Sometimes we go out, or colleagues go out, and try to map particular areas of interest. So what you're looking at here, the mesh is the predicted. The part that's not mesh is the measured bathymetry. And so we're starting to get more detail, and we can use this information to plan follow-on work, like putting remote operated vehicles on the seafloor, to go and actually put eyes on the seafloor and see what we're looking at. And we can then use cameras on these vehicles to look at the ecosystems, to characterize the seafloor, and to learn a lot more about what's happening down there out of reach in this really inhospitable environment that's under lots of pressure and the temperature is not so great. So it's a really amazing combination of tools that we're able to use to get into the deep sea. It's also interesting when you think about getting eyes on the seafloor that it's a little bit like looking through a straw, because you can't see very far through the water. So this is a picture of one of my colleagues and mentors inside of the submersible Alvin, which is operated by Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And when I worked with him as an undergraduate, I remember going to an artist that worked at Woods Hole and having him describe to the artist what it looked like to go to the bottom of the ocean, and in particular to go to the East Pacific Rise, which is a spreading center where there's hydrothermal vents, there's tube worms, these crazy chemosynthetic ecosystems. You can see the little picture of Alvin there in the background. I remember going with him to talk to the artist to make this, and this was in 1994. Not much later, when I was doing my postdoc, we were able to take the sonar system on a remote operated vehicle down to the same site and create a map with measurements. And so this is a 25 centimeter resolution grid. It's very difficult to do this for the whole planet, of course, but in very specific areas we can do this. And this is the kind of resolution that we can see with our eyes in this room, right? We'd be able to see the heads of people, the chairs, the stage, all these things with this kind of resolution data. So one of the things that our group does at Lamont is we work collaboratively with some other folks around the country to support ocean mapping across the U.S. academic research fleet. This is largely supported by the National Science Foundation, with contributions as well from the Navy and also NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And there's been an investment in the whole data continuum, recognizing that these sonars are really important. They're on most of the ships in the fleet, but they require expert skills and knowledge to operate them well. So we have a project that makes sure that we acquire data well and consistently. There's another project that preserves the data and gets it into the National Archives. Another project that works with the scientists who create products, and we make sure that those are preserved and made available for other scientists, so we're not repeating effort. And then we have another project that synthesizes and integrates these data into products that can be shared internationally and made publicly available. So this is a huge contribution to global ocean mapping, and this continuum and project of like handing the data off really has worked very well for us. So if we look at the National Archive that NOAA operates on behalf of the country, at multi-beam data that has been shared, there's a couple points I want to make here. First, just the increase in data availability over time as these sonars have become more common. So this is the distribution of data in the archive. The data was collected from 1970 to 1999. So this is when the sonars were really starting to get into the science community and to become more common. This is the data that's been collected since 2000. So a huge volume of data has been collected and made available. And And when you put that together, you can see that we have a massive catalog of data. Still not enough, but we're starting to really have momentum and have the tools that we need to do this work. So because of this and the availability of these kinds of systems, and also the general needs to understand the ocean, it's important to remember that the US is an ocean nation. Our exclusive economic zone is the third largest in the world. It extends 200 nautical miles offshore, and it's the area inside our EEZ is larger than the combined land area of all 50 states. So it's a huge part of our footprint. In 2019, under the previous administration, there was a presidential memorandum that prioritized the mapping, exploration, and characterization of the US EEZ. And it recognized that this was important to do for future prosperity, health, and national security. So this has led, during the current administration, to the establishment of the National Ocean Mapping, Exploration, and Characterization Strategy, NOMEC we call it. This is really led by a whole bunch of different federal agencies, and they are coordinating efforts and resources to get this work done, to map the EEZ, to explore and characterize it, to help work with the community to prioritize the areas that we should target first, to develop and mature new and emerging science and technologies that can help us do this better and faster, and to build the public and private partnerships that will help make all of this possible. So as a result of this increasing momentum, NOAA is now, on an annual basis, computing metrics about our progress. So this is a map showing the extent of the US EEZ. It's outlined in yellow. Hopefully you can see it well. The parts that are purple are places where we have 3 or more measurements, 3 or more soundings in every 100-meter cell of area. And the places that are pink, we have fewer soundings, 1 to 2, but there's something. And so this has been broken up into different areas, and the computation is done annually. And I want to highlight in the bottom there that as of January 2024, 52% of our EEZ is mapped. So we're just over halfway there, which is good, but we still have quite a ways to go. And the objective, the hope, is that we can get the deep water done by 2030, and then the shallow water by 2040. So we can do this work faster in the deep water because the way that the multi-beam sonars work, we can cover more area more quickly, but it's still a lot of work that has to be done. So seafloor mapping data has really broad use. Of course, going back to the first example, safety of navigation is the first priority, but there's a whole suite of different ways that we can use this data, from geoscientific research, understanding planetary processes, Earth system science, looking at ecosystems, doing management, and really understanding what's there and helping to improve the sustainability of the planet and the world. So after decades of data collection, preservation, and integration, here's our JEBCO map from 2024. Only 26% of it has actually been mapped. So we still have a long way to go internationally. So in 2017, the Nippon Foundation JEBCO Seabed 2030 project was established, and its goal is to empower the world to make policy decisions to use the ocean sustainably and to undertake scientific research that's informed by a detailed understanding of the global ocean floor. And our goal is to have the complete map done by 2030. It recognizes that the ocean is one, and this projection, this map view here really brings the whole ocean together, showing that it is all connected. This again is a collaboration between the Nippon Foundation and JEBCO, JEBCO being connected to the IHO and the IOC. So we lead one of the centers of this project at Lamont, so we work very closely with collaborators around the world. We've defined what 100% mapped means. Generally, the short story is if we can get 400-meter resolution in the vast majority of the ocean, we will have done our job. We, of course, seek to do higher resolution in shallower areas, but there's a huge amount of ground to cover, and so this was a way that we thought we could try to make it tractable. So why is this important? Why is Seabed 2030 in particular important? Well, as I've described, there's a huge range of use of this data. The ocean processes really do extend beyond territorial boundaries. With so little of the ocean mapped, and again, still recognizing that the only way to get this done is through international cooperation and coordination, CEBA 2030 really serves as an accelerator for JEPCO's goals. And we're fortunate now that we have the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development happening in parallel, that's getting more and more scientists and the private sector and governments to come together to figure out how to solve problems in the ocean, how to better understand the ocean. Our approach is regional, very much like a puzzle. You don't try to put every individual piece into a puzzle at once. You build little areas that you then put together into the puzzle. The parallel is quite brilliant. So we're really working to understand the community, empower the community, share knowledge, share data, really change the culture, and build this global coalition that works together. There is a proliferation of mapping sensors that is also happening now. Not only do we have sonar on academic and government and industry ships, but we have sonars on our own private boats. We have one on our little boat. Cruise ships have sonars. There are optical techniques that we can use in shallow waters. So any sensors that we can use to try to get more data, that's what we're trying to bring together. So we're really working to build a global coalition. Some of my team are here with me today, and they've been going around and engaging with people in different parts of the world, from the Dominican Republic to Madagascar, really trying to understand and connect with people, because ultimately it's the people that we have to connect to make the data come together. So the progress toward 2030, if we look at the map, this roughly represents the coverage before the project started, which was about 6% of the ocean. And some of these areas are not quite represented perfectly at the time, because what we've done is refine some of the data sources. This is where we are now in 2024, 26%. So you can see more of the seafloor is lighting up. We're starting to really pull it together. So when we think about this transition from paper, again, this work done at Lamont since its early days, to pixels. And I just want to go back and forth here and show you the remarkable consistency from this first map that Marie Tharp made to this most recent map that we published just a few weeks ago within our group at Lamont. We've come a long way, but if we look at the distribution of data, we still have a long way to go. But we really are in a new era in ocean mapping. We're building on this transition that we've already been through. The emerging technology is really starting to accelerate things. Bringing the people together is critical. Sharing data, tools, and knowledge is really going to help us get there. There are more and more ways to engage, and I also want to highlight the diversity of people that are starting to work in this space. So in the early days, women couldn't go to sea. You can see the sort of homogeneous faces in those older pictures, and then moving toward more recent pictures where we have a lot more diversity, not just in the people that are there and the different ages involved, but the different sectors. We have public, private, government, academics, all different people working in this space. So it's really a privilege and an honor to continue the work at Lamont of doing data curation and assembling these maps and making them available. I'm very focused on making sure that we're not just putting data out there, because technically that checks a box, it makes it accessible, but I want to make sure that we make it accessible so that everyone can really access and work with it and understand what it means. So we're doing a lot to try to build that transition, and also to make sure that we are future-proofing these data resources for the future. So we're not just building a product that is a sort of dead end, but we're enabling what's to come in the future. So I'm going to end there with the thought that this is really the beginning, because we're still building this map. It's one ocean. We still have a lot to learn. And just to leave a quote from Jacques Cousteau about the beauty and the love of exploration and discovery. So thank you very much.
Thank Thank you so much, Dr. Farini. That was fantastic. That was fascinating. And I'm sure folks in the audience may have a few questions from this presentation. So for the last 15 minutes or so until 7:30 or 8:30, or whatever time it is. Lost track of time. But we have a couple microphones in the audience, so if anyone has a question, we can get a microphone to you, and with the microphone we can get it picked up on the video, but yeah, feel free.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. I'm curious, does artificial intelligence play a role in your work, or do you expect it to begin to?
I expect it to begin to. There are groups that are starting to work with that kind of technology. And in particular, I think, at least my understanding is that as we have dense data sets, I think those are particularly ripe for this kind of approach. But as I think about future proofing and making sure that we really cultivate this culture of data sharing, I don't want the final product to be what we save. I want to save the intermediate and the original pieces so that things are ready for the algorithms that we know are coming and that we know will be able to help us with this work.
Towards the end, you mentioned sonar on the bottom of cruise ships. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the public-private partnerships and how the commercial vessels have been involved and how important they are, or what role they play, I guess.
Yeah, so one of the initiatives that the International Hydrographic Organization is really promoting is this concept of what's called crowdsourced bathymetry. So yes, the sonars that we use for academic and sort of government work are very precise and very expensive and hard to get, but there are many, many low-cost commercial sonars that are out there. And most vessels, particularly of particular sizes, are required to have navigational sonars. So if we can tap into that, we can tap into a huge amount of data. Some of these vessels, like if you think about super yachts, for example, they go places that other boats don't go. And so it's going to give us some data in a place where we have no data. In other cases where we have many ships coming in and out of port, it can help us identify changes in bathymetry before a new nautical chart is made, for example. So there's a lot of different ways to leverage this data, and we're hoping that we can get more countries on board with the concept of the benefit of it so that they will approve the acquisition and preservation of that data for themselves and for the world. I like that I don't have to make the decisions.
How often, given your last response, how often is the seafloor changing as you go between these different mapping times?
So the rate of change of the seafloor is going to depend on the processes that are happening there. In the coastal areas, you can imagine that there's going to be there's the potential for a lot of change on short time scales as storms and waves interact with the seafloor. In the deep sea, volcanic processes happen, tectonic processes happen. You'll remember a year or two ago, there was the big volcanic eruption in Tonga. So that volcano, we had actually been there mapping a few years before after a previous eruption. So the data that we collected was used in the post-eruption mapping to understand the volume of this volcanic explosion. So there's a lot of things that we anticipate the rates of change, and some places where we don't yet because we still don't know a lot about what's happening in the deep sea.
I think this might be a rumor, but I'm curious, is there truth to speculation that the Atlantic Ocean is getting bigger and the Pacific Ocean will get smaller because of the plate tectonics?
So the Atlantic Ocean is spreading apart slowly. It has been spreading for many, many years. I don't even know what, what unit of time measure to put on that, but a long time. And the Pacific, there's a lot of subduction happening, right? So the ocean plate is going under the continental plate, but North America is moving west. So yes, these plates are moving at scales that are quite slow by our terms and our understanding, but yes, the motion is definitely real and definitely happening.
Thank you so much. Besides the data, you say that you sometimes take samples, right? Besides the just location of the data, and in the Atlantic, like there is a lot of history because many millions years ago, and it has some data related to the magnetic pole. And can you talk about that? What is that, and how is that relevant today?
Yeah, so some of the data collected early on with the Lamont vessels were another really key bit of evidence about seafloor spreading. And so the magnetic polarity of the planet switches over various timescales, and that is basically imprinted in the rocks. The magnetic minerals in the rocks align with the polarity. And so if you look, there's data from the Pacific that was the sort of seminal work that brought about the understanding of seafloor spreading, where the magnetic profile across the ridge crest was symmetric. So they took it and they flipped it, and it was the same on both sides. And so this led to the understanding that those peaks and valleys in the magnetic signal, if you put it back together, they were formed at the same time on the ridge crest, and as it pulled apart and time continued to imprint this magnetic signal, you see this polarity switch. I'm not sure that we can predict the rate of the polarity switch, but we can see the history of it, certainly.
So I have two questions, and you can pick which one to answer. One is, do you learn anything about biology from these measurements? And then the other is, so I think about processes on land, being like erosion and so on. What are those similar processes? Obviously not the ridge uplift, but other things that make the...
Can I answer both? With the sonar, we can do some biological imaging, again, with the water column in particular. We can not only see bubbles, we can see fish, we can see basically changes in the acoustics. We can sense if it's in the water column or on the seafloor. There's a whole other discipline that does that kind of work. In terms of the evolving landforms underwater, yeah, they look a lot like what we see on land. I was saying earlier as we were looking at the THARP map that near India, in the Bay of Bengal, there are these beautiful meandering channels that look just like what we see on land. And we slowly get a strip of data and we get another strip of data, and it all starts to puzzle together. And you can see abandoned channels from before and the active channels from today, and there are levees along the sides, just like on land. So, yeah, from currents. It's beautiful.
Thank you. I don't know if you can answer this, but you were saying about future-proofing. And right now we are very quickly trying to get as much of the metals as we can for AI, for example. And then they had the whole thing about the the metal-rich nodules. Future-proofing environmentally, how can we use this mapping to future-proof against environmental degradation?
So this is a very challenging question about how these data can be used for hopefully responsible use of resources in the sea, especially thinking about the fact that the global ocean beyond national jurisdiction technically belongs to everyone, right? It's the world's ocean. So I think that the best way that I can answer that as a scientist is to say that we are acquiring the data that we hope will be used to make informed decisions and to establish policy that will make sense. It's certainly not my domain to understand how to manage the policies, but we definitely don't know enough about these environments, and collecting data and putting the information together and making sure that the data are shared and understood and that people can make informed decisions is something that we can definitely contribute to.
Hi, great talk, by the way. Thank you. I just want to, could you elaborate a little bit more on why the deep sea mapping is easier than the shallower? Because there's a lot more data in the shallower from what I could tell, and I didn't understand that bit, so.
Yeah, I didn't put that slide in. So normally I have a slide that shows, so when you think about a flashlight shining on a wall, when you're close to it, the area that's lit up is small, and when you back away from the wall, it's much wider. So the sound beams that we're using work quite similarly. So if the ship is 2 kilometers above the seafloor, and we have a swath that's 4 times the width of that distance, we're going to have an 8-kilometer wide swath with a whole bunch of sound beams that are giving us measurements. If we move into shallow water and it's 10 meters deep, we're only going to see 40 meters across, right? So just the geometry of how the sonar systems work is a big part of that. The other piece, however, is that in the shallow waters where it's clear, we can see through the water with optical techniques. And there are some emerging techniques that are actually looking at how the waves are breaking and the consistency of those patterns to compute what the depth underneath is likely to be. So there are ways that we can try to close that gap, but it's definitely much more time consuming in the shallow water. And part of what you saw was an optical illusion, because we're looking at a broad scale, and so the dots come together and they light up.
With the increased investments and advancements in bathymetric LiDAR, do you ever find things on the ocean floor that you wouldn't expect to be there? Maybe, you mentioned Bengal. I know that there's a sunken land bridge that used to be above water between Sri Lanka and southern India. Do you ever find, human, settlements or things like that, just things that shouldn't be there?
Those kinds of observations, I think, are probably better made either with very high resolution mapping or optically. So seeing, there was, when I was a graduate student, we mapped the Hudson River, and there were some mounds that we found in the data, and it turned out that those were from the Revolutionary War. They were defensive mounds that were put up to help prevent ships from coming up the river. So there are things that we can certainly see. And of course, the ocean is, a museum of sorts in a lot of ways. There's a huge amount of archaeological relics there that have not yet been found. And so, again, as we do this work and we reveal the seafloor, comes responsibility of making sure that we don't release data prematurely or put things at risk that are of cultural significance. So there's a lot of balancing that has to be done.
Hi, thank you for this talk. It was very informative. I have a question about when it comes to mapping 100% of the ocean floor. You only have so many resources with a giant ocean. How does the group prioritize which places get mapped first? And what's how do you decide? How do you prioritize? Everyone has their demands. Like, how do you prioritize everyone's priorities?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. So one of the interesting things with Seabed 2030 is that we aren't doing a lot of the data acquisition ourselves. We're relying on other people to do the data acquisition and to share the data with us. That's not to say that we don't try to help with this prioritization exercise. And so depending upon where you are in the world, like here in the US, we have this NOMEC strategy where we're trying to do our EEZ on an accelerated time frame. Within the context of Seabed 2030, we try to get information from the community of stakeholders around the regions that we focus on. We try to be thoughtful and equitable in our approach so that it's not just sort of the big countries that have the most resources that are dominating. We try to build collaborative relationships and understand needs and try to use that to help direct attention toward places that need this kind of work to be done. But it's very challenging, for sure. And it's also fascinating, right, to figure out how to make this work.
Thank you so much for coming, and of course, thank you so much to Dr. Farini. Fantastic.